With the costs of surveillance and mass information gathering becoming cheaper and easier, laws are struggling to keep pace. Who is fighting for transparency and working to protect your digital rights? Our guest today is Danny O'Brien. Danny has been an activist for online free speech and privacy for over 20 years. He co-founded the Open Rights Group and has defended reporters from online attacks at the Committee to Protect Journalists. He's now the Director of Strategy for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I'm your host, Chris Parker, and this is the Easy Prey podcast. Danny, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Prey podcast today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Can you tell our audience a little bit about who you are, how you came to be associated with the Electronic Frontier Foundation? I got it right.
You did, after all that discussion that people always put freedom in there, which is, a perfectly fine place for freedom to be. Yeah. So I joined the EFF in 2005, but before that I was a journalists writing about the kind of topics that EFF works on, sort of broadly digital rights or civil liberties online. And I've been tracking EFF really since its beginning in 1990. And EFF has been around really since the very beginnings of at least mainstream digital communications and the internet. Of course, the internet precedes it by many years, but the deal is that some of the pioneers of that world began to realize exactly how unprepared the rest of the world was for the kind of effects that technology was going to have. Mm-hmm. So I've been tracking it. As I say, I was a journalist and wrote about this primarily in the UK, as you might be able to tell from the remnants of my accent. And then actually I sort of returned to the world of journalism, at least for a few years after my first stint at EFF. A lot of the first few decades of EFF's existence, we ended up trying to describe things that seemed very theoretical to people. So in the early 90s, we were talking about the importance of encryption when the US government was actually trying to pretty much ban it worldwide. And we'd have to throw up these hypotheticals about what would happen if the government had the private keys to everybody, and people would be very confused. And then around about, I think, 2008 or so, a lot of these theoretical issues that we were dealing with became very practical very quickly. And I actually sort of shifted to the Committee to Protect Journalists for a while, because what we were seeing was, at that level, malware and state-sponsored attacks being targeted at journalists and other sort of canaries in the coal mine, sort of human rights defenders who were the first people to be really individually attacked in that way by state actors. So I spent 3 years, and I wouldn't say I was on the front lines, but I was definitely talking to people on the front lines, people in Russia, people in Syria, and of course in the Middle East during the Arab Spring. And then with that kind of knowledge, I went back to EFF and helped sort of connect the dots a little bit there from our theoretical work to how we might do some more practical assistance to the people who were really at the cutting edge of the digital revolution and the revolutions that digital environment was provoking around the world.
So what was some of that practical assistance that you provided for journalists?
Well, when we started, it was very on an individual case-by-case business, case-by-case what's the word? Basis. A case-by-case basis. I think at the beginning, we were looking at these issues on a very much case-by-case basis. So we would have folks working as foreign correspondents in China, and they would say, I really think there's something odd going on with my computer, and we would end up sort of poring over it or talking to people and seeing the patterns of While we weren't entirely sure whether they were state actors, because attribution, as ever, was very difficult, certainly very concerted attempts to target journalists using knowledge that really only intelligence service professionals might have. So to sort of separate this from your common or garden phishing attacks, and the one that really stuck in my head and made me start thinking about this from a government level espionage was the Foreign Correspondents Club of Beijing was getting invites, fake invites. There would be emails saying, I'm the editor of The Economist and I'm coming to Beijing. Let's meet up. But they weren't being sent to the journalists themselves. They were being sent to their assistants. And their assistants' email addresses and names weren't widely known, right? That was not something that they weren't their kind of secretaries. They were their sort of people who sorted out their work in Beijing. And that's the sort of information that you wouldn't expect a common or garden criminal to have. But it's, of course, exactly the information that those correspondents, government handlers, would have. So that was the kind of evidence we were dealing with there. And of course, since then, what we've seen is the rise of targeted attacks that, as the cost of 0 days have sort of gone up, they've moved from this sort of environment where really anyone could do this kind of thing. And sadly, that's still kind of true. To things that you would imagine that they were being operated on a professional level, if not at a governmental level. So that was the early shift, and I think now we're just in an environment where I think a huge chunk of the targeting of journalists that isn't just kind of petty cybercrime does have, if not, again, government connections, then you can certainly begin to suspect that it's people that journalists have upset.
Criminal enterprises who they've written negatively about or exposed.
Yeah, it's interesting. As I was sort of saying that to you, I'm sort of rethinking on the fly some of the assumptions that I've always come into this with, which is that there was a time when the thing I had to explain to people, when really their only idea of government espionage and sort of cyber surveillance was the NSA, that what we were seeing was a kind of democratization of surveillance, that actually the tools to conduct a spyware-style monitoring of a particular person were now so ridiculously cheap that it wasn't. You shouldn't just assume it was the NSA or China or even Russia, right? That it's actually could be anyone. And again, like some of the parameters of that were when we were dealing with journalists, where we'd sort of sit there and go, okay, this is strange. And this was usually in the denial of service attack space, right? So this is when people would have an independent website and then that would be taken down. And of course, you'd sit with the journalists and say, well, who might have a grudge against your website? And they'd be like, I'm a journalist. Anybody we've written about in the last 6 months might want to bring down this content.
Like a great example of that would be like Brian Krebs, that whenever he would post about cyber criminals or whatever, he would be under denial of service attacks. His website would be down. He'd be attacked. Right. I mean,
and it's like motive and opportunity. Like if you're a journalist and you stick your journalistic stick into the beehive of the computer underground, then yes, that Krebs gets it in the neck. But what we would see, and I guess this was 5 to 6 years ago, was really very not particularly well budgeted state actors suddenly in this game. And I think, we talk about advanced persistent threats, right? But I think one of the things that sort of people forget is that they're not terribly advanced, right? Not necessarily, but the persistence comes from a sort of institutional persistence, right? That there's somebody whose job it is to get up in the morning and make somebody's life unpleasant or monitor them and surveil you. And that has a particular pattern and a particular penetration that is different from, a drive-by petty criminal or someone who is just pissed off with you this week, right? And of course, again, one of the classic moments when we realize that these hackers or hacking attacks were taking place against journalists in China, or were China related. We never knew whether it was really the state or the government. It just happened to be kind of broadly allied with what we would suspect that they would do. So, for instance, when Gmail was targeted for hacks, I guess in 2009, 2010, it was the fact that the particular Gmail users that were being targeted there were Tibetan activists, which was the tell, rather than, oh yeah, we traced the IP and it was coming out of China's HQ or whatever. And that shifted to, I think, one of the next big indicators was when people were just mapping it to the 9 to 5 of the IRA in Russia, right? That like people would clock on, hack, and then clock off, or spread misinformation, and that was the next tell, right? And I think that's what I mean about like this professionalization of these attacks.
It's almost corporatization. You've got your Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. This is the time that it's my job to go after journalists, and that's what I do. And I clock out and I go home.
And, literally in the case of the sort of spyware and malware that's used against dissidents and journalists, in that you have companies like NSO Group who are taking and productizing really something which up until now, it seems a strange word to use, but were kind of bespoke systems, or people, taking a particular environment and then doing sort of, well, I was going to say pen testing, but there's no testing in it. It was just simply penetration. And now we have this thing where there's actually an industry and a business supporting governments or other well-heeled actors who want to do that kind of thing.
And that's crazy. We've seen lots about that in the news, at least with respect. I'm an Apple geek, and so I see that a lot with, so-and-so has this gray box, which can get into iPhone 6s, iPhone 7s, iPhone 8s. As the number slowly creeps up to the one that you've got.
Sure. And, returning to sort of the digital civil liberties space, this was what was so odd about, I think, one of the key cases in the last few years in the United States about people's right to have some privacy in their devices, which was the Apple San Bernardino case, where the FBI began and then dropped a judicial attempt to get Apple to essentially re-engineer their operating system to provide the FBI access to one of the San Bernardino terrorists' devices. And in that sort of situation, what was odd is that they were taking a legal run at this when, as apparently became the case very shortly afterwards, a particular company had actually learned how to crack that particular phone. So you have this odd thing where when the tech doesn't work for breaking these things, then there's an attempt to make a legal attack on privacy. And what's disturbing about that, I think, is because all of these things are going on in this incredibly gray area where governments are saying, well, as long as we're capable of doing these things, we should and can do these things. And there really isn't a tight enough legal structure to determine both when they have the right to do those things and what limits there should be on the technology they use to achieve it.
Yeah, and it's funny. Like I'm not a journalist. These things don't directly impact. I'm not a terrorist, but I can see both sides of these arguments. That you like, well, gosh, when someone's going to go out and kill a whole bunch of people, I want people to have access to that information, but I don't want them, spying on journalists. And do I trust them with the keys? Do I not trust them with the keys? And even if I trust this guy with the keys, what if he drops the keys and gives them to somebody else?
Yeah, I think what we want is some sort of set of clearly defined limits about these things. And definitely, I think one of the saddest truths about the last 20 years is a lot of the actual practice of digital interception and surveillance has come not actually out of our existing judicial standards for this, which is, you get a warrant. If you want to tap somebody, you go to a judge and you ask for a warrant and you give a very specific reason why you want that. But from the practices of the intelligence community, which sort of by definition exist outside of the normal rule of law. Yeah. And we've had this structure for at least since the 70s in the United States, and I think this is pretty much the norm internationally, that we understand that the spy agencies shouldn't operate domestically, but anywhere else in the world, anything goes, right? By definition, almost, they break laws in other people's countries. I'm pretty sure that what James Bond does in the movies is not, in line with the laws of Russia. And that's actually the wrong way to think about it, because, one of the reasons why these intelligence services were given such a broad brief is partly out of sight, out of mind. This is happening somewhere else in the world. And also, theoretically at least, it was only affecting a small circle of people, right? But essentially, the brief is that if you're agents of a foreign power, would be the phrase, right? You could do these things. And what the globalization of digital technology has meant is that, well, first of all, I think that that's a really odd dividing line, right? Where we're allowed to do this outside the border, but we can't do it inside. It was unsustainable, right? What ended up happening, and this is what EFF has been fighting in the courts since 2007, is that inevitably that surveillance program came home to the United States. But the other part of it is that the numbers grew, right? So the surveillance programs that are taking place became mass surveillance programs. I can imagine a world where people could use targeted surveillance tools such as the spyware that we describe on individual journalists, but bound by the normal process of law, where you go to a judge and, touch wood, a judge would not say, no, you can't have a warrant for investigating this journalist just because they said something bad about you. But you can have it for this person because we suspect them of planning a terrorist act. And we've kind of skipped that bit entirely, right? We've gone straight from what we had before to just spying on everybody and then collecting that data, and even applying it to everyday citizens domestically. It's like we've got so much worse at policing and judging surveillance than we ever had in the past. And we weren't great at it in the past, to be honest. But
it's what technology seems to do to everything, that there's an exponential factor to it. It used to be that if you were a surveillance organization, whether you're government or domestic, whatever you want to call it, you want to follow somebody, well, you've got 3 shifts and 6 people on each shift because you don't want them being seen. You're talking multiple people to watch one individual. We now have one individual that can watch thousands and tens of thousands of people or millions of people or even no individual because it's all automated. The scale of it has just grown exponentially.
When you're trying to think about how these laws and these precedents and how regulations should work, I think one of the things that really comes home is how much our previous norms and laws kind of lent quite a lot on the physicality and the basic economics as existed in an analog world. And if you just get rid of those, or as you say, things become exponential, or things collapse to a zero cost, it really changes the dynamic in ways that you're not expecting. Let me give an example, which is that one of the sort of loopholes in U.S. law that we're actually pretty successfully fighting, I would say, with some pretty major Supreme Court victories, is how easy is it to get geolocation data from a phone? Without getting too much into the details, it used to be that there were 2 standards for, communications warrants, one of which was getting the contents of a call, and the other thing was getting everything else.
The metadata.
So the metadata, exactly. And the argument was the metadata wasn't as revealing as the contents of the call. Geodata, which is basically where your mobile phone has been at any point when it was on for months in the past, for as long as the ISPs or phone companies log it, is metadata, but it's pretty revealing metadata. It may actually be, I would say it's more revealing metadata than the content of any of your phone calls. I can't remember the last time I had a phone call, but my phone knows exactly where I've been for the last, actually, to be fair, I haven't been anywhere for the last few months either. But,
it knows
anyway,
you've been home.
Right, and it could tell if I left. So we've been fighting this quite hard, and I think judges who now have mobile phones begin to realize that this is not an accurate sort of dividing line between serious and non-serious investigations. But one of the things that really transformed that whole process was the police used to go to the if you've seen The Wire, the police go to the phone companies to get this information. And then eventually one of the phone companies said, look, let's make this easier. We'll write you an internal website, and you can go and make requests from that internal website. And of course, the number of requests went from a few thousand to millions because it was easier, because suddenly the economic and the bureaucratic cost had dropped. And those are the parts of it, the environment, which aren't necessarily, part of an inevitable digital rationalization of these things, and aren't written into the law, but have a huge effect on the level of surveillance and who gets surveilled and what people can do with that surveillance.
And then it's getting even more murky now, is that they don't have to go to the phone company to get the data, because the phone companies are now selling it, or the app developers are now selling it in mass. And we don't even need a warrant for the information now. We just go out and buy a subscription, and now we have the data without the warrant.
The laws again, I'm sort of speaking mostly of the United States here. The laws constrain what the government can get, but it doesn't really currently constrain in any useful way what companies can voluntarily provide. I mean, there are some constraints on, as you say, telephone companies, but I thought it was very revealing at the beginning of the pandemic when a lot of companies, in a sort of burst of civic duty and also the chance to get out a press release, would publish the information that they had about how people were moving around. And it switched pretty quickly from, oh, that's fascinating, all these people go to Florida and then fan out across the country, to, wait, there's a company that I've never heard about that knows where everybody is at every point of time. And I think that kind of underbelly, that what we need is a sort of transparency about that before we can get to the reform.
Yeah.
We get that. I mean, sadly, we get that in the government space through whistleblowers, in the commercial space from people who don't realize when they go public with their product that everyone is not going to reply with, wow, how cool, but go, what the hell? If you saw what happened with Clearview AI, right? A facial recognition system that has just spidered everybody's public picture and then devised a fairly straightforward system that if you show it a picture of someone, can tell you who they are. And sounds great in the lab, but if you ever think about the ethical and political consequences of something like that, it becomes far more serious.
It starts to become a sci-fi movie from a few years ago, in a sense. Is like, oh, now as I walk by a street sign, the display changes and projects an ad specifically to my shopping behaviors.
It's utterly amazing how many things that we would have thought of as completely sinister and weird and an indication of, Stasi Germany, which we now sort of take for granted. I mean, look, I'm literally talking to you with a camera above a screen. And that is actually the thing I remember when I read 1984 for the first time and went, oh, a TV that has a camera built into it. That's authoritarian. And we have these systems around. And really, I remember listening to Eric Schmidt speak when he was still the quotes adult at Google, and I remember him sort of describing to a bunch of somewhat aghast journalists very breezily that often Google would internally demo something and they would have like a sort of creepiness test where they would show that they were capable of doing something internally and then go, that's too creepy. No one's gonna like it if we reveal that we can actually do that. Yeah. And actually pervasive facial recognition was one of those things, because I remember discussing that with Google engineers and product folk, and they were thinking about introducing it into their tools. And we were like, you do not want it. Well, you should know how this is going to be misused in authoritarian or near authoritarian settings. And I think that creepiness line is something that is very, very fragile. It disappears almost completely in emergencies. I mean, again, going back to the beginning of the pandemic, it was amazing how many editorials were written by people. And I'm sure, a few people listening to this podcast will be nodding along when people were saying, you know what, we've got this pandemic, we need to be able to track everybody. And hey, we have these companies that are already doing that. And, at EFF, we'd like to actually be correct. So we spent a lot of time looking into this. And the most fascinating thing for us was, talking to epidemiologists and talking to the engineers who were building this sort of stuff at Google and Apple. And I think the important key component was people going, this might not help as much as people think it will help. Because it's not, we're mashing two things together here, right? We're mashing the information we collect in order to, target advertising and the kind of data that epidemiologists want. And it's not the same. We're throwing tech at this problem. And I think 6 months on, we realized that, there weren't going to be any quick answers, that the solutions actually come from a reasonable use of a lot of different strategies. And the country, no real country has done this. Google and Apple put it into a location recording, which actually has some pretty good privacy qualities to it. But it wasn't what people needed, or certainly wasn't sufficient. Mm-hmm. And the sort of stuff that people were proposing right at the beginning would have been so incredibly privacy invasive and probably wouldn't have worked, which is like the worst of all worlds, right?
Yeah.
You give away your privacy and it doesn't actually solve the problem, which again is what we saw after 9/11, right?
And it's the sort of thing, I think, when you don't understand in the early days of, not that we have this thorough understanding of how coronavirus works and how it spreads, we still don't really have a great, this, hey, we can tell you exactly how long surface is airborne. Like, it's getting there, but like in the first weeks and months, there was we're just throwing up our hands going, oh right. My gosh, we're all going to die.
And, as technologists, we're very capable of, acting very quickly and reaching for a toolkit of things that we can use. I mean, so a lot of what EFF does, you could throw into two rough camps, right? Which is free speech and privacy. And in the early days of the internet, I think I viewed those two things as like uphill and downhill battles, right? It was really a downhill battle to fight about free expression, because it was kind of baked into the technology that free expression was going to increase. It would actually require people to kind of step up and start proactively censoring and blocking it. With privacy, we had an uphill battle because the technology lent to weakening those protections against your intimate details just leaking out. And of course, the two things are somewhat connected in that way. And sometimes we have to be really careful that the solutions that are the simplest solutions from a technological point of view, we haven't just moved the complexity somewhere else in the system, that we're not actually solving a problem. What we're doing is we're creating 20 other problems in completely different areas of what we're dealing with.
The law of unintended consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. And like anybody who's programmed, anyone who has built hardware knows that there's like the noble dream of like, I can see it very clearly how to achieve this thing. And then everything conspires against that. And there are lots of these things that complicate your simple answer. And sometimes those complications are in the area of human rights.
Mm-hmm. I know there was, I remember seeing a machine learning study where they had looked at people's retinal scans, correlated with a whole bunch of different health conditions.
Right.
And they got to the point where we can throw your retinal scan in here and we can tell you whether you have some particular heart condition. And the initial thought is like, oh, well, that's awesome. Now I could just, look in front of a camera. But, well, now what if they start correlating other stuff?
Right. And I think we're actually pretty bad at predicting, even experts. I can't kind of overstate this, how much EFF's work often consists of just like looking at a technology and not trying to catastrophize it, not going, oh my goodness, this could be very bad if it falls into the wrong hands. In many ways, our instincts are kind of the opposite. Our instincts are, how could this improve the way things are? But really, how often, even if you spend a lot of time thinking this stuff through, things can take you by surprise. I mean, I just think back historically from almost everybody I know who's involved in the early, kind of in the .com boom, uploaded all of their photos to the web. And I think people are much more cautious about that now. And that was people absolutely on the cutting edge, understood, how to build a gallery program online, understood the nature of image recognition, but would never have thought, oh, I'm creating my own. I'm contributing to the facial recognition database, or I'm contributing to something that will learn what locations look like, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like every picture on the public internet is really contributing to a system that would allow you to locate where a photograph is. And I'm not saying that, I'm still happy that all these photos are up there, but those almost immediate consequences were not things that we, even the experts, anticipated.
I remember it was funny that you're talking about that. There was a program, an app designed for to interrupt like child sex trafficking. And so what they were asking people to do is anytime you visit a hotel, take a picture of the room.
Right.
So that if we ever see these things in the background of sex trafficking, we we know, oh gosh, this happened in this room in this hotel, and you could probably even date it, which like incredibly noble intentions, but like how wrong could where could that go wrong in a sense?
And I think those best intentions often are the things that remove that, oh, this is a little bit creepy sense from people, right? I think that right now it's interesting in that the battle over one of the biggest battles we're fighting at the moment, and I referred to it earlier, is in the 90s. There was a really persistent attempt to just prohibit the use of strong encryption, and this is the strong encryption that now holds the economics of the world together, the things that protect credit cards, the things that protect your data at rest. And it's just math. It's very simple math. And there was a very determined attempt to prohibit initially the export of this. Mm-hmm. So people were literally being targeted because they were moving a mathematical formula from one part of the world to the other. So ridiculous to us, but the argument was, this will fight terrorism. Now what we're seeing with bills like the Earn It Act in the United States and a really concentrated attempt in Europe all reveal around child sexual imagery. Mm-hmm. And the argument is that we used to be able to monitor and spy on everybody and sort of scan this for these sort of abhorrent images. And now, because people are using encryption more widely, we can't do that anymore. And therefore, we need to stop this advance, right? And again, the arguments are sort of compelling if you think of them from the point of view of what they're trying to stop. But if that wasn't there, if that impetus wasn't there, what it hides, which are the huge societal implications of not only requiring every piece of software to be fundamentally insecure, right? But also that if somebody did invent something that was more secure, that we would have to ban and prohibit it. Mm-hmm. So again, to give an example, one of the arguments we're having in Europe at the moment, where this is kind of taking the lead just this week, is both this will make things insecure, and also you're going to have to ban program software. You're going to have to create a great firewall of Europe that prevents secure tools in other countries from being used in your collection of nation states. So people will have to delete Signal or delete WhatsApp when they enter creating a society that, for the sake of a very, very important particular rule, re-engineers the whole rest of society is so strange, and so hard to explain to people.
And it's, I think the whole view is because, it's about the children, and
right.
Their argument is that for and against that, your argument is, well, but it's not just about this situation. Right. It's such a wider, broader implication behind this.
So my colleague Cory Doctorow says, we used to argue about digital rights. Well, it turns out that all rights are digital rights these days, and all laws about the internet. All laws are laws about the internet, right? So in this sort of example, in the early years of the EFF, the hardest thing was to go to judges and say, this small change in how you regulate the internet is going to have massive ramifications on the rest of what the next 10 years of society are going to be. It was very hard to explain to them. But in the end, the stakes were pretty low for them, right? If we convinced them one way, they would go, well, I don't know whether this is going to change the world. It doesn't seem that important, but I guess I'll do this. Now it's kind of flipped in that everybody knows the internet is super important, which means that whenever there's a problem in the world, somebody somewhere decides that problem is the internet's fault or can be fixed by messing around with the internet in some way without realizing that, because they're applying a very specialist viewpoint to this, just what the ramifications everywhere else are going to be. We so often have to bring new other people into the room, whether it's, bankers who come in and go, actually, if you prohibit encryption in the way that you want to, the entire financial infrastructure will collapse. Or in my case, bringing, dissidents or activists or members of diverse and targeted communities into the room to say, actually, you might be even doing this in our name, but this is not going to help, and it's going to make things worse. A good example of this a few years ago was a thing called Sesta Foster. And Sesta Foster had it was in fact sex trafficking, right? It was meant to be this fix for sex trafficking because internet companies weren't liable. It's the whole Section 230. Should companies be liable for the communications of their users? And the argument was, we'll pass this law that will just narrowly make intermediaries liable for the sex trafficking that goes on. Seems, a reasonable argument, right, for a very serious cause. The consequences, which we depicted before it went through, tried to explain to everyone, had everyone say, so you want child sex trafficking? We said, look, what's going to happen is all these sites are going to remove sex work, casual encounters, things that look like prostitution. And what that's going to mean is it will push all of that underground. It will just remove the ability for sex workers to communicate with one another, to organize. It will restore what used to be the status quo, which is that every sex worker had to either go on the streets or had to have a pimp and so forth. And that's exactly what happened. They passed the bill, and sex workers, who are literally the people that this bill is trying to help, all came forward and said, this has made us less safe. It's hard to predict those things unless you understand the way that the internet and technology connects and influences everything. Like you said, unintended consequences.
So what do you see as kind of the future or upcoming threats in the terms of digital rights and civil liberties?
Well, I mentioned one of them, which is there's definitely a big push right now to undermine encryption. We're using the argument that we of abhorrent kind of child imagery, and that's The ones I worry about, the ones where there are bipartisan support, which is so rare at least in the United States right now. And that when you see it, you realize that this is something that may just be accelerated through without due consideration, because I have to say politicians in the US are now so frustrated that they cannot achieve anything, that if they can achieve anything, they'll do it.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of that which is not getting the due consideration. Another one is kind of the tech backlash, which, as I hope is conveyed by a lot of what I've been describing, I think that there are a lot of problems that have been created that we have to work on solving. But the problem with the tech backlash is that the solutions are going to be often worse than the problem themselves. Sester Foster and this sort of attack on intermediary liability protections, clumsy attacks on that, are going to cause a problem. The other one is kind of taking advantage of the power of these big companies. Again, we talked about Apple, and Apple got to where it is in many ways by having such a complete control over its ecosystem. And Facebook and Google now have similar levels of control over a softer, less hardware-based environment, and Amazon is somewhere in between. Well, the problem is all of those companies now have a degree of control over our personal devices and our personal information that is unimaginable, right? And as you pointed out, the problem there is eventually governments will go, well, we'll just get these people to do the spying, or we'll just get these people to rewrite the software to turn our personal devices into tracking and spying devices. And that's this line that's very hard to fight, because everyone hates the tech companies and don't want them to have power. But the governments really want to strike some kind of deal so they get to share that power. And the real problem for this is what the government should be doing is dealing with the problem of these companies having so much power, rather than entering into some sort of power sharing agreement with them, right? And the real thing that strikes me as the biggest thing we have to worry about is we set ourselves up in a world where governments and politicians feel that they cannot survive without the continuing existence of these sort of quasi-monopolistic powers, that you can't actually dismantle them, because if we dismantled them, it would be anarchy, because we wouldn't have the ability to censor at the level that they can censor, or collect data, vital societal data at the level that they can collect that data.
It's almost this the government is so dependent on these entities that we can't dismantle them because we're so dependent on them, but we can't allow them to go forward and continue doing what they're doing.
Yeah, and so many of these, what we're going to see is a big bunch of technology regulation coming down the pike, and so much of that technology regulation ends up being a compromise between what the politicians want and what the companies want. And the real problem is that there are no users in the room, right? There's nobody representing what the users want and what the rights the users should have. And we at EFF try to play that role, but obviously it helps if other people are in the room too, which means sort of demanding these things politically, and sort of raising awareness of them, and when you can, taking that control back for yourself. If everybody had switched to iPhones, then it would be very hard for anyone to be able to argue that an app store isn't an absolute requirement, or locking down the system is an absolute requirement. So it's always useful, even if you're in the minority, to be exercising the rights that you have.
So I'm trying to think the way to phrase this. What do you think are the most fundamental rights that we should be exercising, that we really should be, what are the switches, what are the settings that we should be thinking about? It's just not necessarily, hey, go into this directory and turn this off and turn that on. But what are the things that people should be thinking about in terms of taking ownership of their rights?
Right. So I think that, you can take a sort of very individual point of view. I mean, I'm talking to you on GNU Linux, and I try to use software that gives me a degree of that kind of access of freedom, right? But I also think that and there's a limit to that individual kind of selection. I don't think everybody's going to end up using GNU Linux, right? But I do think that, always I think a sensible choice is always to think about your own autonomy. I think we've all been in that situation where we've got really excited about a piece of technology, and we've gone into it, and then we've gone, oh, not again. I'm like locked in to this environment. And so bearing that in mind, being able to pick privacy protective tools, or just tools that let you move your data from one place to another, trying out tools like we have Privacy Badger, which is an easy plugin that you can download from www.eff.org. But the point of it is that it exercises your right to remove trackers and ads from your web experience. So using tools like that is a really excellent way of both kind of incrementally improving your own privacy, but also you notice when they go away, right? We're entering into this big fight with Google and Chrome right now because Chrome has been slowly narrowing the API that extensions can have. Yeah. And it's just got to the point where they're kind of going, ad blockers kind of need to use a bunch of this API that we're not really interested in maintaining anymore. And that's a canary in the coal mine again, right? That's like one of those things where you notice that if you notice that going, you will kick up a fuss. So again, in order to preserve these rights, you sort of have to exercise them. And in the case of technology, it's about building something which is privacy protective, that gives you a lot of autonomy, that lets you not just obey what a company or a government wants you to do, and then building your life a little bit around that, so that when that goes away, you can go, okay, alarm bells are ringing. I need to, call my congressperson, or take to the streets, or install GNU Linux after all.
Well, it's finding that balance of, okay, I need to take steps to make myself aware of these things. I need to take steps to protect myself. But finding the balance between, okay, I now have to, what's the most obscure OS that I could possibly install? And I know I'm never going to get any support for it. Obviously that's not realistic for most people. So it's finding that balance between those two things.
I'm not taking a sort of security vegan line about this, but what I am saying is that I think everybody listening to this podcast probably is a authority figure about technology, whether they want to or not, right? They're probably the people that other people come to and say, what should I be using? Yeah. And I think because of that, it sort of falls on us to try and think some through consequences. I also sort of think that sometimes, and I know some people go completely the other way, but often we kind of project our threat model onto other people. And so when somebody says, oh, I want something that's really easy to use, we give them something which sort of locks them down into a world that we personally might not want, but hey, they're not as complicated as we are, right? And I think that sometimes we overdo that, right? Sometimes we don't walk people through all the consequences of what they're doing. So people end up being the consumers of technology without being active citizens in a technological world. It seems very vague. I was trying to be specific about this, right? Which is that, when you're helping someone install something, give them choices and explain what those choices are. And when you're think about explaining why you might need an ad blocker. And it's not just about blocking the ads, it's about blocking that malware and explaining a little bit about the economics that about how all of these things work. In the same way as I think it's useful sometimes to explain to people that some of the stuff they're being told about cybersecurity is there to scare them.
Yeah.
Right. And we know that, you and I know that a lot of this stuff is snake oil, or a lot of it is written in a way that is like designed to make people go, oh, that sounds terrible. I need to do something about it.
I need to spend money.
I need to spend money. But really what I've learned in like teaching journalists about security and all of these things, that actually being scared is the last useful thing. It's just not useful for people to make reasonable assessments about security or about the things that they need to be to buy. People need to be treated like citizens again, right? Rather than people to scare into doing something. I think it's sort of a tragedy that as the unintended consequences of technology begin to play out, we've ended up playing up the fear of the unknown and the fear of technology to try and get people to do what they want. We try really hard not to do that at EFF. It's hard sometimes because, pretty much everything we say these days sounds so terrifying. But fundamentally, if you go to sites like Surveillance Self-Defense, ssd.eff.org, actually, one of the things that's interesting is we do another site called sec.eff.org. I'm sure these will be in the notes.
Yes.
But SEC sort of explains our thinking behind, it's for educators. It explains our thinking about the advice that we give. And a lot of that, it came down to us going, oh, we have to learn how not to scare the living daylights out of people. They need to be able to think about this clearly, and that does not help.
And I like that. I think it was on the SEC where there was, creating your own security plan of,
Right.
And really helping the person to understand the thought process behind what they're doing, not just, hey, do this. But it's like, okay, what do you want to protect? Who are you trying to protect it from? What are the consequences if that person gets access to it? And probably the more likely one is, well, how likely is it that this is going to happen?
Right.
I mean, I don't need a 40-foot. I don't need a 40-foot wall around my house because the likelihood of someone needing to get that high is really, really astronomically not going to happen.
People always come to us going, oh, well, how do I was going to use this software, but hey, I heard that like the NSA can get around it. And I'm like, if you're being targeted by the NSA,
you've got bigger problems.
An app is not going to help you, right? But kind of unpicking what that means is that they've read about mass surveillance by the NSA, and trying to bring people up to speed about what that means is, and what it means is very minor. It's not like being targeted as an individual. It just means that the government knows exactly what everybody is doing all the time, right? And it's a different kind of worry.
Yeah.
I think the biggest, and people switch, right? People shimmy from being scared to having this sort of privacy nihilism, we call it, right? Where they just go, there's nothing I can do. There's nothing I can do.
Why should I bother having any
Why
defenses?
should I bother, right? It's sort of the even more depressing version of like, well, I've got nothing to hide, which is like, even if I did, they'd find it. So, and the point, what you have to get people to is the point where they're worried about this stuff, or they understand it enough to be concerned, but their next act is to talk to somebody else about it, or write to your lawmaker. One of the things that I find fascinating is that lawmakers don't really know about this stuff, but when they do, if you catch somebody at the right time, they not only go, oh, wow, this is really worrying. They go, and I could be the person who fights for this, right? Like, because it's an open market. There's so few politicians picking up and running with this right now. The changes aren't, it isn't, we don't live in a technologically determined world. There were many decisions that were made that got us to where we are now. And there are many decisions we can make to make a better future.
I think that's a great place to end. I could probably talk with you for hours about this stuff, and we'd both be gleefully smiling the whole time.
I know. It's very odd. If you could see the video of this, I'm talking about these dystopian things, but I'm like grinning with excitement. That's something that we can do about it.
And that's, I guess that's for many of us, at least in the United States, things, if we don't like the way things are, it can change.
It really can. And if the reason I like technology is that, it's an engine of change, and it should be empowering. And I think anybody who likes technology has got a taste of that empowerment. And I think that people should be able to take that and run with it and change it, even when it's the technology that you want to fix.
That's great. If people want to support the Electronic Frontier Foundation, if they want to follow you, wisdom, how do they find you? How do they find out more about EFF?
I'm Mala, M-A-L-A, on Twitter and Mastodon. Because that's where I roll. But the most useful thing you can do is pay for my sandwiches at work and donate to EFF.org. We're actually membership driven. People don't realize that, but actually a huge majority of our funding comes from individual members. So if you sign up and become a card carrying EFF member, you're literally enabling us to do the kind of judicial, technological, and activist work that we try to make the world a better place with. And
for those in the U.S., are you a tax-deductible nonprofit?
We're a 501c3, and we do stuff. I haven't talked about it, but I was actually an international director at EFF as well. And we do stuff all around the world as well. And there are digital rights groups like us in pretty much every country. But if you can't find one, give some money to us or just write to me and I will find you one. Or maybe you could start one.
Ooh, I like that one. Danny, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Pray podcast today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Have a great day. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Easy Pray podcast. If you like this episode, help support the podcast and our mission by leaving a review at easypray.com/review. Notes and a transcript of this episode with Danny O'Brien can be found at easypray.com/35.